Good afternoon. My name is Faye Taxman, and with my colleague Bruce Turnbull, I co-chair the Jewish Council for Public Affairs Criminal Justice Initiative. JCPA is a national network of community organizations that are very vested in social justice issues in our community. We represent about 125 different Jewish community relations councils and 16 national Jewish organizations. We convene together and we work together on a number of important social issues. As a response to the unfortunate death of George Floyd, a very grievous murder, JCPA has continued to make a pledge to work to end systematic racism in U.S. policing, criminal justice policies, and how we deal with members of our minority community. This is an important goal for us as an organization. We've had very strong relationships with African American organizations to deal with civil and social justice issues. Today, I have three important speakers who will give us some insights into this question about defunding the police, as the terminology has basically been used, or issues related more so to how do we right size using police in our society. We'll start with, Police Chief Carmen Best from Seattle, Washington. Chief Best has basically been the chief of police for a little bit, almost near 2 years in Seattle. She's had almost 30 years of experience as a police officer, working up through the ranks, very active in national associations, including the major cities chief police association. Reverend Jerry Brown is the president of RECAP, Rebuilding Every Community Around Peace. This is a national organization. It presents a different way of helping our cities deal with the critical issues that relate to how do we support the quality of life for every citizen in our communities. He builds partnerships between faith-based community organizations, governments, law enforcement for the strategic goal of reducing violence and disorder in those communities and also helping to improve people's lives. And Adam Gelb is the president and CEO of a relatively new organization called the Council on Criminal Justice that Mr. Gelb founded. He's been working for over 30 years in this area of criminal justice reform. Before coming to the council, Adam led the Pew Charitable Trust criminal justice work, and he's had great reach in terms of helping us rethink how we use prisons and sentence people. And so he has some insights today into the questions about, this critical issue about police. So I've asked each of the panelists to spend about 4 minutes to kind of give an overview of their perspective. I'm going to keep them to the 4 minutes. Then we have a few questions that we have outlined based upon conversations with our constituents. And you, as an audience for this webinar, can also add questions into the question and answer, and we will then feed them to our panelists. So Chief Best, would you like to begin our conversation today?
Well, of course, thank you. First, let me just say that thank you to the Council on Criminal Justice and, of course, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs for allowing me to be here today. I'm very excited. I'm saying good morning because it's 10 a.m. where I am. I'm not sure about everybody else, but very happy to be here to chat with you on this very important subject about unpacking the discourse on policing and public safety. So I'll just start by saying this, for far too long, just to set the context, our country and certainly our city here in Seattle have allowed for racial inequity, especially towards African Americans. And we've allowed for it, and we haven't been able to wrap our hands around how to resolve this really pervasive issue of race and racism in our society. And certainly it manifests itself in a number of places, but the highlight and the focus right now is in the arena of criminal justice and specifically on policing after, as you mentioned earlier, Faye, the murder of George Floyd. Really, it's brought to light once again the disparity and the anger that people feel when these situations occur, and when people, particularly African American men, die at the hands of injustice. Recently, my family members and I marched in some of the Black Lives Matter parades, not parades, but demonstrations that were in honor of Mr. Floyd, but also seeking for racial equity and fairness and justice. And what's interesting here in Seattle is I've been here my entire career, and we are on year 10 of a consent decree, and we followed every single metric and every single requirement of that consent decree. We have de-escalation. We have crisis intervention. We do 5 times more training than anyone else. We do implicit bias training. We work with the Northwest African American Museum. We work with the ADL. We've done a lot of work that's been required, turn in the reports, work with the federal monitor, the Department of Justice, and the federal court, and we've done a really good job. And yet, when we go out to these demonstrations, I see signs that say defund the police, stop police brutality, no more qualified immunity. Even though we've done everything we were asked to do to build the trust and the confidence, and I do believe we have a lot of wonderful measures in place and in our reforms, all the reforms everyone else is asking for, we've done them. But even with all of that, people are still feeling very angry. They're still not trusting the police. And a lot of that has to do with, the fact that every week, when we talk about PTSD, every week after you see someone die at the hands of injustice or police involved, or even sometimes involved with their own neighbors and family members, you don't even get a chance to adjust and process that before you see another one. I mean, we saw the murder of George Floyd, and within a week, I saw another African American man right down the street from Seattle and Tacoma also died at the hands of police. And then we have another one in Atlanta. So these things continue. So while we try to get our structures in place to a certain degree, it's the real time, everyday happenings and occurrences that are really striking to the heart of where people are with criminal justice and our criminal justice system. And what we're going to do and what we're going to need, in my view, is we're going to need the entire community to be on board in order for us to make real, lasting, and equitable change. And I believe that the future of policing worldwide is changing. And the Seattle Police Department, of course, not only supports it, but we want to lead those efforts. We really feel like we need to be involved and engaged and in the forefront. I think many people, including the protesters, are unaware of how many of their demands have already been met by the Seattle Police Department when I see those signs. But what they are aware of is their feelings of, I would say, hopelessness in many cases. Like, we've done all this work, we're continuing to engage, and yet every week, and I say that sort of metaphorically speaking, but every week it seems like we're seeing yet another set of injustice. So we're really working to figure out ways that we can bring the community under the tent. How are we really and truly going to re-envision and reimagine policing in a way that people feel like they're engaged and involved, and that they're making a difference in how, in the connection of how they're being policed and how neighborhoods are working with the police service. I think that until we do that, we're going to continue to have problems. And I think we also have to, as a piece of this, I mean, while we're focused on criminal justice, as a piece of this, we're going to have to recognize that police agencies and criminal justice systems are really a microcosm of the larger society. So there's also disparity in our educational system and in our healthcare system and so many other institutions where there's disparity in the treatment and the outcomes, particularly to people of color, but specifically to Black people. So I think we need to acknowledge that, acknowledge the history, acknowledge the fact that police agencies historically have had problems and been used to maintain the status quo, when in fact we could have made things better for people of color, for LGBTQ and other areas. So what I have suggested is that not only do we embrace our role as public servants and public service, but that we really invite community in and re-envision what we can do. Engage with the community. And some of the suggestions that we've come up with on our own, we want to make sure the community is invested. but maybe adding a community member to your command staff, not a sworn person, not a cop, maybe didn't even come up through the agency, but has the credibility and the knowledge of the culture of the area, that they can really be a good ear and be a reliable resource and an influencer. Have collaboration that's ongoing and consistent, and those kinds of things as well. Reinvest in our resources, and reinvest in what we're doing and how we do it. Here, when they're talking about defunding the police, there's a lot of things that have come up. We don't know where it's going to end, but I think the conversations starting are good. And I'll just wrap it up by saying some of the things that we're looking at is, I believe that the police service has been utilized in many ways to fill the gaps of other broken systems. So if your mental health system isn't working well and doesn't have the ability to service people who are struggling in crisis, often people dial 911 and here comes a cop. And that officer is now on the front lines trying to address that mental health issue. If people are struggling with addiction and abuse issues in that regard, often if those services aren't there for them, people see a person, strung out on drugs or other issues, they call 911 and here comes a cop. If people are unsheltered, they're not capable of taking care of themselves and they're living outside on the streets and they're not sure who to call and how to get help for them, they call 911 and here comes a cop. And so we often are dealing with a lot of issues that have nothing to do with crime, but really to do with societal issues and other systems that have failed. So when we look at what we're doing and how we're going to better serve the community, we should be looking at ways that we might engage, other entities that are better equipped to handle some of these really pervasive problems and unpack some of those issues, as well as the racial disparities that we're looking at. So I'll close on that note because I could probably talk all day, but I want to give my panelists a chance to chat as well.
Thank you, Chief Best, and we appreciate that. Reverend Brown, do you want to give us your high view of your perspective here?
Sure. I think I want to give Chief Best a license and a pulpit. She sounds like a but we are thankful for Adam and his organization for allowing me to be here, and also for the JCPA for their graciousness for having me here. As a Baptist preacher, I can talk for a long time.
And I'm only giving you 4 minutes.
Yeah, I know. So I'll just take the 4 minutes. But I've been doing anti-violence work in communities of color in cities across the United States for 30 years now. I was a part of a public safety crime reduction strategy in Boston that saw this amazing reduction in violent crime in a 29-month period in which we had 0 juvenile homicides. I wish I could say, and Boston lived happily ever after, but it didn't. There were times in which the crime went back up again, and people came together again, community, city, police, in order to work on the issues to reduce the violence, and it did. And then the crime would eventually rise back up again. The problem that I see now in the 30 years is not just problems with policing and policing approaches and changing in presidential administrations. It has to do with the structural issues that persist, the structural weaknesses that are in our general society that are felt most acutely by communities of color, that we have not decided how we're going to resolve them. I'm talking about failed housing policies over decades. I'm talking about failing educational institutions and the unevenness when it comes to majority communities versus communities of color. I'm talking about persistent unemployment and underemployment in our inner city communities, and poor health care. And then when you throw in guns and you throw in drugs, little wonder that you'd see this culture of violence emerge through these structural weaknesses. The police are just the tip of that spear. They are an instrument of this larger problem. And there are problems within the relationship between police department and communities of color. And I've spent years upon years trying to work with people to find solutions around that. But if you talk to your average citizen, average Black citizen, they just want to be a respected member of the community, and they expect for that police department to respect them as they respect other sectors of their city. That does not happen. And people feel the weight of that when they see an outstanding incident like George Floyd happen, or Michael Brown, or Breonna Taylor, or Tamir Rice, and everybody says to themselves, this could happen to me. And there's an awakening that's happening right now. I was at a march in Boston, Franklin Field. 55,000 people showed. One of the most diverse marches that I've ever been a part of. Just everyone from all walks of life were there because everybody recognizes that there's a problem. But the question we're going to have is, what are we going to fix? Are we just going to fix the policing, or are we going to fix everything else? Communities of color, and particularly Black communities, are waiting for that larger question to be answered. In the meantime, we want the police department to respect us as citizens. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Reverend Brown. Adam, your 4 minutes.
Honestly, do I have to go, or can we just turn this back over to Reverend Brown and Chief Best? No,
Yeah.
I really appreciate the partnership here between the Council on Criminal Justice and the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. And I hope, Faye, that the folks at JCPA are well aware what they have in you, and that the audience is also well aware of how lucky they are to have Faye Taxman be part of your organization and leading this effort. She really is one, and has been for a long time, one of the top people in the country for actually conducting research and putting it into action in ways that matter in communities. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you, Faye, and to join with Chief Best and Reverend Brown, who are members of our organization, the Council on Criminal Justice. We are a national nonpartisan think tank and an invitational membership organization bringing together all sectors of the field, all disciplines and ideologies, and seeking to be a catalyst for solutions that enhance safety and justice for all. And so part of that mission for us is to ground these conversations in facts and evidence and fundamental principles of justice. And so I'm gonna take a slice of my time here, Faye, and do just that. I'm gonna put out two numbers here: 240 million and 4%. 240 million, the first one, is the number of 911 calls that police get a year in this country. That's about 650,000 a day, and about 27,000 times an hour that people in this country call the police. People want police. People need help, and that's a lot of calls coming into the police department, the police departments across this country. Many of those don't need to come to the police department at all. They can be offloaded to other functions, as Chief Best was saying a few minutes ago. It's not clear, I don't think, to anybody right now in this conversation that has just been kicked up as it should have been in the last few months about exactly what percent by department could be offloaded to other departments. How can we safely draw the line between when a police officer, somebody with a badge and a gun, needs to respond, and when another agency can respond? But it's very hopeful that this conversation is just starting. I began my career here in Atlanta as a reporter on the night shift, and I spent a lot of time in the 911 center. And I can tell you from that long ago experience that a lot of things come into 911 that have no business there, including even people who frankly just call the police sometimes because they know somebody will answer, and they're lonely, and they're looking for somebody to talk to late at night. Second number is 4%, and that is the percent of total state and local spending on police. 4%. Now, police department budgets have increased.
4% of what though, Adam?
4% of total state and local government spending. It's not including federal numbers, and that's a number from the Urban Institute, and it's a percentage of total state and local spending in urban jurisdictions that has stayed consistent over time. Over the last 30 years, it's stayed at 4%. So if you look at the raw numbers and you adjust them for inflation, you're going to see that they've gone up. They have gone way up. But so has spending for education and healthcare and other government services. And that 4% number has stayed consistent for 3 decades now. And so I think it's just really important as we enter this discussion today, but generally, that folks who have some notion that even if you did defund the police and actually wipe out the entire budget and allocate every penny of it to education and health services and everything, you're looking at a 4% increase. And I don't think that there are many people in this conversation who would find an increase of 4%, mid-single digit percentage reallocation of spending to be something that is going to produce the kind of transformational change that we need and that people in this country deserve. That's not to be pessimistic. I'm quite optimistic and quite honestly think that there's a way to reallocate some of that money to much more productive things that can reduce violence in communities and that can reduce the harms that police are causing in many ways. But that's just a general overview and hopefully a little bit of stage setting for the rest of our conversation.
Thank you. And I want to thank all 3 of our panelists. So let me dive into some of the questions. We already have about 20 from our audience. Plus we had some from, that we've talked about. So I want to start out, Adam did a nice job of talking about the huge volume of calls for services that really impact what police do and how police do things. But there's a perception out there that those calls for services are primarily around violent crimes or violent incidences in our communities. And that police really spend more of their time, as people like to say, catching the bad guys, whatever that means. But that's really not what police spend their time doing. So Chief Best and Reverend Brown, can you give us a little bit of insight into this question about what do police spend their time doing, and of the things they spend their time doing, what could potentially be transformed into other organizations? You've hinted at some things, but let's get down to this critical issue that a lot of the public have about the police basically spending their time on doing, crime catching sort of activity.
Well, Faye, that your question couldn't be more timely. We just recently were talking to our own, our own electeds and city council as they're looking at how they might reallocate and redistribute funding and what that might mean for our organization. Some of the things that we're looking at, we just took a overarching look at how many calls for service we're responding to and what is the outcome of those calls. Many of them are not what we would call, they're crimes. They're non-criminal complaints. For example, like I said earlier, homeless people in the street, people who are in crisis and engaged in odd or disconcerting behavior, loud disputes that aren't necessarily criminal in nature but are distracting in some way, or people who call in things that they think are suspicious, or whether they really are or not end up being a crime, often is not the case. So we respond to a lot of those types of calls for service where there's not really a criminal complaint, but there is a complaint of disorder. And we find that we are often at the intersection of public health and public safety on a number of the things that we are responding to in the city. So I don't have the exact breakdown. I'm actually going to try to see if I can get the exact breakdown by officers. But, it looks like it's about 48% of our time is spent on 911 calls. About 8% is patrol support. meaning we're at taking reports online and doing putting them in that way. About 10% is on special responses such as barricaded persons, hostage negotiation, and that sort of thing. About 20% is on follow-up investigations after we've been to a call, fingerprinting, searching out witnesses, and that kind of thing. And then about another 7% is spent on administrative things, going to training, reviewing policies, and that kind of thing, defensive tactics. So the breakdown is, there's other smaller things that we are engaged in too, but we're not spending all our time chasing criminals. In fact, we're doing a lot of other things that have been required for the police department to be involved and engaged in.
So Reverend Brown, what are some of your ideas about this question about, given what police actually have on their plate, what are some of the reforms? Someone in the audience asked the question, describe a vision of what a modern day police department would look like. And maybe it's not just a police department, but a community response team. Right? Thinking about the fact that, what Chief Best just said, quite a number of these are homelessness or, other sort of disorder issues that don't necessarily need someone with a badge and, all the equipment that police carry. But people want to know, what should they be advocating for? What would that picture look like in those communities?
Yeah, I agree with the chief. I think that there is quite a lot on an individual police officer's plate or a police supervisor's plate, parsing out the 911 calls for various things that maybe a social worker could handle, or a social worker with a police officer, or a mental health professional with a police officer could handle. I've heard conversations around how can we take some of these things off of the plate of police officers and imagine some kind of combination where you have other professionals teaming with police on calls. And, and I think that's something that at least begins to reimagine policing in a particular community in a way that would favor the community. But I also think that accountability is important as well. And I think part of the frustration that you see across the nation and some of these high-profile incidences that we've had is that people get frustrated over what happens to the police officer who commits, these horrendous offenses. And a lot of them seem to walk away. A lot of them seem to continue as police officers. Some of them even get promoted. What do you do with a police officer who has dozens of complaints that comes from citizens about their behavior? Is it a matter of retraining, or at what point do you say we've got to let you go because your behavior is such where we just can't deal with it? I was dealing with a police department where a chief actually asked me, I've got an officer that has 32 complaints over like 3 years, and I'm trying to figure out what to do. And I'm like, you got to get rid of them, but saying that and doing that when you have unions and collective bargaining agreements and all of that is a different thing. And I think what people are really looking for is an avenue of accountability that could be put in place where if there's somebody who is spoiling the bunch because he or she is a bad apple, you can get rid of them.
All right, thank you. So Adam, one of our audience members wants to know about this 4% number. And they are sort of indicating that they think when you include the state, which doesn't really have a lot of police presence, but if you actually looked at the city level, particularly urban centers or counties, would that number look different in terms of the percentage of budgets? They particularly identified, we're in Montgomery County, Maryland, and they identify Montgomery County as an example where there's a much larger percentage of the budget. In Baltimore City, about 25%, according to this question, or person asking the question of the budget. So what are your thoughts here? You know, you use that 4% number, but I'm just wondering, you know, if maybe at the city or county level, it's actually could be quite different if we just look at that base.
It is, and I'm glad for the question. You know, from the policy standpoint, the relevant question is how much money is government spending in a jurisdiction? Not so much. It's not irrelevant, of course, whether that money is coming from the city government or the county government, or in places, I think like Seattle, where you've got things pretty combined. But how much money is government spending there? So yes, the police services tend to be funded by the municipal jurisdiction, and so they're a much higher percentage of the budget of that local jurisdiction. But when you're thinking big here and you're trying to understand what is the overall allocation of public resources to public safety versus social services versus health and education and things, the relevant question is how much money is being spent by all units of government. That doesn't include, that 4% figure, for instance, doesn't include any expenditure by the federal government. Again, the Urban Institute, which has led the way for so long in terms of crunching these numbers, doesn't include federal expenditures there, and there are almost no federal expenditures whatsoever for public safety related services, a couple $2 billion on top of the roughly $250 billion that is spent by state and local governments in this area. So that's where that comes from.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. One of the questions from the audience is basically has to do with, you know, the relationship that Reverend Brown, you spoke about between Black and Brown communities with the police department. And, you know, this particular individual basically wants to know, isn't really the heart of the problem that police do not haven't really evolved much from their initial function and role as the, you know, slave catchers? This particularly seems to occur with the way that the police act within Black and Brown people in this country and those communities. And the fact that in the Black and Brown communities, you know, the police are not seen as the protectors of the communities, but more the protectors of wealthy individuals and people of privilege. So how do we evolve from that perception? How do we evolve from this notion about, you know, the police being servants of the community at large, regardless of, you know, the wealth or status of individuals in those communities?
Yeah, I mean, and you tack on to that statement the feeling that comes from the community that there is a containment strategy that has been put in place by the larger society. As long as we keep crime, as long as we keep violence to this particular area, then the rest of the city is healthy, which is a lie. You know, we live in a society where we're interconnected with one another, and so our weakest link is supposed to be telling of our strength. And it, you know, you have communities of color, and particularly Black communities, who are sick and tired of the normal that sort of keeps people in a certain place with limited resources, and then having a finger pointed to them as if it was their fault that they're in this position in the first place. It is not. It has been a larger strategy, whether it has been intentional or benignly neglected, a strategy nonetheless to keep you know, people of color and Black people in a particular place, and folks are sick and tired of it. And you know, for me, the way I see it, it's what continues the cycle of violence that we keep fighting against within our inner cities. I mean, one of the things that has broken the success in many communities is when law enforcement teams with the community in order to, you know, find ways to reduce violence. You know, and I'm trained communities throughout the country, faith communities, community-based organizations, to engage at the street level and to find partnerships with police departments. And you have some measure of success, but then something happens where the resources dry up, the relationships get fractured, officers get promoted, some folks go to other jurisdictions, there's even turnover among the leadership, and there's not a good succession plan, around that, and the cycle continues because the structural weaknesses are still weak. And I think what people are looking for is not just reforming the police department, but they want to reform everything. They want to reform education. They want to reform, the economy and how it impacts everybody. They want to reform, healthcare. So this conversation that we're engaging in would be myopic if we were just talking about the police department. We should be talking about everything.
So, so a lot of my work, as Adam knows, is in the area of corrections, primarily with people who are under some sort of correctional control. And a large emerging issue is the trauma that people feel about, both the presence of the police, but also the impact that people have about, through arrest and being stopped by the police, and how that trauma actually, if it's not attended to, can actually add to violence or more disorder in those communities. What would you say in terms of this larger picture, which I think you've characterized well as Chief Best, that this problem is really not just a police problem. It's a problem of marginalized communities through all facets of social institution. But to me, listening to the voices of people who have been involved in the justice system and the trauma that they speak to leads me to think that we really need a different type of response. So do you have any thoughts on, besides including people, which, obviously is very important, although as some people say, that you've risen to the occasion when you're actually running the meetings and not just being present at a meeting. So giving up the power that social institutions have. But what would you say in terms of thinking about how we could sort of address these larger issues?
Yeah, I think, not to minimize including folks at the table. I think that's an important piece of it, but it also depends upon who you have at the table. My congresswoman in this district, I'm in Boston, her name is Ayanna Pressley, and she has often said, those who are closest to the pain are also closer to the answers. And my whole experience in working around anti-violence strategies is really looking at young people not as the problem to be solved, but to look at them, as really partners in, a violence reduction strategy. Talk to the gang members, talk to the drug dealers. And in this case, you want to talk to folks who are experiencing every day the weight of this oppression upon their lives, and to ask them, what ideas do you have, around this particular issue, and together maybe we can come up with an answer. So it's not a hypothesis that somebody tests upon the community, but the community is involved in the creation of that hypothesis that could be tested. So I think that's a piece of it.
Okay, thank you. So quite a few people have mentioned in our questions that got raised about guns and the presence of guns. So the commentary here has basically ranged from This is directed at Chief Best. Should we actually, not allow police officers to carry guns, all the way to, a general comments about criminal justice reform, which is if we can actually get a handle on guns and the presence of guns in communities, would that actually have a reduction on violence? And also the way in which the police interact with the community. So I guess, Chief Best, I'll start with you first about sort of this question about, whether police officers should carry guns or they should be more like their counterparts in England, which do not carry guns. And then I'll ask Adam to address the larger issue of gun policy in the U.S.
Great, thank you, Faye, and thank you, Reverend Brown, for your really wonderful comments. I am still of the belief that that we're going to still have to have some guns to respond, because people in society have guns. If we were ever to come to the point where we didn't have that, certainly that would be the ideal, the utopia, and something definitely worth striving for. So for that reason, I would say that we would still have to have that ability to respond to gun violence. If somebody was taking somebody hostage or shooting, then we'd want to respond and the like. That said, ideally, we should be doing everything that we could do to limit and minimize gun violence in our city. And I think that means healthy intervention and prevention programs, particularly with young people, so that they aren't, finding guns or at this day and age, making ghost guns and using them to harm themselves or others. Quite a bit of gun violence is actually self-inflicted as well, and people sort of discount that. But removing guns from young people makes them safer, makes society safer, and I certainly would adhere to that. And if we could ever get to a point where there were no guns left, it wouldn't hurt my feelings.
Thank you. Adam, you want to add to that?
Boy, I don't know that I have a tremendous amount to add to what the chief said. Common sense gun safety measures have a large part of this debate, and I think that's especially true for the Jewish community, where over the past year in particular, there have been a number of attacks and killings at synagogues, and so it's an understandable, it's taken an understandable central role in this conversation. It has to be there. When we're talking about police violence, we're talking about violence in the Black community, there is a whole set of other strategies that's got to come into place. Reverend Brown and Chief Best are on the forefront of implementing those types of strategies. And the good news here is that over the past 25, 30 years in particular, we've learned a pretty good bit about what works and doesn't work. What we haven't done very well is actually implement those things. And Faye, I know this is the horse that you ride 24/7.
Yeah.
A lot of times right now in our field, the issues are actually more of management and implementation than they are of policy. We got a lot of policies in place. Witness chokeholds being banned in New York City more than 20 years ago. But all the other pieces and infrastructure that needs to be in place to actually get these policies and practices implemented with fidelity is what's needed. And I think if I could just make a little bit of a turn here, where the defund the police conversation gets difficult, because when you think about reallocating resources away from departments into other services, which has to be done at some level and needs to be done, is that going to actually reduce? And do you want to reduce the amount of money that's going to the police department if you want the police to be really good at doing the things that we know that reduce violence and crime? And that maybe means paying officers more. It may mean things that cost money to do.
Yeah, thank you. Reverend Brown, do you want to add something?
Yeah.
Since you do a lot of work in this area?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I've looked at the police department budget here in Boston. I think it's like $500 million, like nearly $500 million. Overtime is somewhere like $62 million. You know, for years I used to say if we just had $5 million that we could spread among the community groups that are actually impacting the youth and really supporting them, the things that we could do together in partnerships. But the money continues to go to the police departments and they're, you know, the community groups, and you know, and there are dozens of them in almost every community that are actually on the ground doing the work. If they had more resources, if they had more people, could really build some strong partnerships across the board. But because they are always woefully underfunded, you know, people are just, you know, doing things on a shoestring and a prayer. And so, so yes, I mean, when I look at an overtime budget of like $62 million, and I'm thinking to myself, come on now, you know, our mayor in Boston immediately cut $12 million, you know, off of the overtime budget, and it just didn't seem like a lot of people blinked as a result. And so I'm like, there are ways in which you can, if you really are serious about what Faye advocates for, is executing what we know works, then you'd find the money to do it. And it's not all in the police department.
Thank you. Chief Best, people are talking about citizen advisory boards in police departments and what their role is. Does Seattle have, oh, I'm sorry, citizen review boards. Does Seattle have one of those boards? What kind of authority does a board have if they have one? If you don't have one, what is your thoughts about these types of mechanisms? And I think,
Well, oh, sorry, Faye. Yeah, well, we have, you know, we have both advisory boards and we have civilian review boards and civilian oversight. So we have a community police commission that has 15 members, 21 members, I'm sorry, 7 appointed by the mayor, 7 appointed by council, and 7 at-large members that come in. They work with us on policy, on accountability. They are a part of they were an offset, if you will, of the consent decree process. We also have, you know, our Office of Professional Accountability, which has civilian members there. They do all of the review on complaints. And then there is the Office of Inspector General, which is a city-funded organization that does review of everything from policies, procedures, training, audits, and review. So a lot of oversight and accountability is built into our organization. And I think it's important that we have those different people and their different voices and perspectives to inform us how we move forward. But since you did mention it, I will say that I also believe in the advisory councils and advisory boards. They play a role. You just have to be careful about making sure some people become they become members, and then you want to make sure you get new, fresh ideas, and it's not the same people with the same, you know, for 20 years on the advisory board. They have a lot of value, but you want to also make sure that board is getting fresh perspectives as well. I think there's a role for each of those. The more informed we are, the more we're connected we are to every you know, every member, the better we'll do our job.
So do you feel that, you know, particularly dealing with, you know, police officers that have a number of infractions, that these boards can be useful? Or do you think that those types of boards have should have a different role?
Well, the Office of Professional Accountability, they deal with most of the complaints that come in on officers. And so, and I as a chief get to see when, you know, there's a, you know, how many, if somebody comes before me, how many complaints have been there, and it matters. But it's a little nuanced, I would say, as well, because some of those complaints could be, you know, they were late for training 3 days versus 2 complaints where they were alleged to use excessive force or something like that, which would, to me, be much more weighty than, you know, somebody not being timely. So while everything is important, I think that, you know, we need to do an individual review of people before anybody is promoted or advance in our organization. We take a thorough look at any of the complaints, how many have been sustained or not sustained, how many they have, and why. So I think it's really important. It's a really important factor as to how we deploy people and how we keep them in our organization, or whether we keep them in our organization.
So I think one of the issues that was raised earlier has to do with the health of police officers, the mental health and physical health of police officers. And so a general question from the audience is whether or not we have in place sufficient enough resources to really help police officers deal with PTSD or, their own exhaustion from, the types of work that they're involved in, particularly seeing the darker side of life, oftentimes, that occurs. So what are your thoughts about, how we can also, in this movement and thinking about the police and the role of police, think about also supporting those citizens who rise to the occasion, who want to, protect our communities?
Okay, I think that's for me to start with anyway.
Well, I think that anyone.
Well, recently in the last couple of years, there had been a high number of officer suicides in New York and in Chicago, in particularly, where they were really struggling through this issue, and it really brought about the national conversation about officer wellness, mental health. How are we treating our people, and what can we do to make the work environment better and safer for them? I mean, we put guns and badges and tasers and pepper spray in the hands of people who are just people. They're trained, but they have real life issues and concerns, and we want to make sure before we set those folks out, onto the streets, so to speak, that we have done all that we can to make them completely whole and performing at their utmost. And the fact of the matter is, in many cases, officers are dealing with a lot of stress and PTSD from going to one incident after the other that can be relatively traumatic. And we have to make sure that we give them the space and the ability to process those situations. In our department, we have a wellness unit. Most agencies nowadays have one. We have a psychologist assigned there who's on call, not only for the officers, but for their spouses and others. It doesn't go through the chief or anybody else. It's completely anonymous, so that they can feel confident and in their ability to work through any issues that they're having. There's a lot of stigmatization with going to people, and we really had to work hard to make sure that it's not stigmatizing, that we want people to be healthy and whole, that everybody deals with these stresses in their job and in life, and we just want to make sure that we're doing the best that we can, not only for the officer's sake, but for the sake of anyone who's coming into contact with them in the field. It is now almost status quo for an organization to make sure they have that ability to work with an officer on their wellness issues.
Thank you. Reverend Brown or Adam, you want to add to that, or?
No, other than to say that, the same kind of trauma services are needed within the community. I mean, we see so much, that occurs around trauma. In Boston, we have trauma teams that are community-based that go in to try to help families, cope with, not only homicides, but also seeing homicides. There's a church, Roxbury Presbyterian Church, that has a program in which folks can come in who've lost loved ones to violence, and if they've witnessed violence, to come and avail themselves of the services that they provide. So, a lot of that happens in the community as well.
So Reverend Brown, there's one question that one of the audience raises that has to do with the question of, can you name a model or any city where they have this mixed teams or partners of social work and mental health workers that handle certain types of calls, or police officers are not sent out on those calls? People are looking for examples that they can actually talk with their own local, jurisdictions about. Mm-hmm. So where would you send people?
Well, I know that in Boston, we had some social workers that were assigned to the police department. I'm not sure where that is now. We have a new commissioner, but Boston has always been a progressive city when it comes to policing. Hopefully I had at least a little bit of something to do with that. But you know, progressive policing aside, you know, I think some of these models are going to have to be built out. I mean, you know, I really do believe that we put much too much on police departments, and that, you know, we have to take some of that off the plate, and some of that has to be handled in the community. So, you know, if someone has a mental health issue, I think oftentimes sending officers there is the wrong thing to do. If you had a mental health professional teamed with them, then, you know, perhaps a certain situation could be handled differently and not, you know, have a tragic end. So, you know, I can mention progressive, you know, police departments, you know, Boston being one of them. You know, there's a lot of work that's being done out in California. You know, I can mention Seattle perhaps, but you know, I think we're probably going to be walking on new territory, you know, around that. But I think that's what we're talking about, you know, defunding the police, eliminating the police. There are some folks who feel that way, and it's based upon, you know, a deep history, not just of policing, but of how, you know, African Americans have been treated. But I think if we can start reimagining what, you know, policing for all would look like, where folks will be able to live in the community and feel, you know, respected by the enforcement arm of the laws, and not being felt pressed upon and dehumanized, then that's a kind of reimagining that I think needs to happen and needs to happen now.
All right, thank you. I would refer the audience also to a program in Eugene, Oregon called CAHOOTS, Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. That particular program was recently featured actually on NPR in case you're interested, but you know, they have actually served as an alternative to police, where some of the 911 calls are redirected to the social workers and community members. All right, so we're almost out of time. I want to give everyone 30 seconds to basically tell us one idea that you think is most important for our local advocates to think about as they pursue this work in their own community. So I'll start with you, Reverend Brown.
I would say in terms of policing, it's around accountability and how unions impact that in their collective bargaining, any kind of advocacy around that. So to ensure that if, you know, somebody is messing up, that they can actually, the chiefs can actually fire them, then yeah, that's the kind of thing I would like to see folks do.
Okay, great. Adam?
Yeah, I would say there has to be greater accountability for officers. There has to be culture change and a movement of a mentality from warriors to guardians. But I'm gonna end on a super nerdy note here, even though I think this is really central ultimately to moving us down the path, and that is to have people triage the calls themselves. And that is, right now we call 911, you're thinking emergency, you're thinking I need a cop. And many cities, including Atlanta, have a 311 system. And I think a big part of this down the line is going to be to have people say to themselves in their own minds, I don't need somebody with a badge and a gun to come here. I want a different kind of service, and I'm going to call that general, easy to remember 311 number from my city and say, I need a social worker, and I need. And when people start to demand a different type of service that way and triage calls themselves, and I think we'll be a lot further down the path.
Thank you. And Chief Best, you have the last 30 seconds.
I wish I could
something new and exciting, but I actually agree with the panelists here. Issues around accountability, and making sure that we hold officers accountable, making sure that we do the culture change, that officers are guardians, not warriors, making sure that there are alternative ways of service to provide service, and that there are ways that people can do that. For example, the CAHOOTS program that you mentioned, Faye, is one way that we can look at maybe having community-led and community-based responses to issues that aren't necessarily under the law enforcement or policing realm. So with that, I think that, you know, continuing to have these conversations and staying enlightened and educated will only make us all better and perform better.
All right, thank you. I want to thank the Council on Criminal Justice, Adam Gelb. I want to thank Chief Best and Reverend Brown for your participation today. I know that the Council on Criminal Justice and JCPA is very appreciative of you guys giving your time and insight, and thank you very much. Everyone have a nice afternoon. And I'm sure we'll see each other again in this virtual world we live in. Thank you.